Hello and welcome to today's Schiller Institute conference, Syria Sanctions Must Be Lifted. The death toll in the Syrian Turkey earthquake is now more than 46,000, but yet even now the United States and the Anglosphere, more broadly, continues to weaponize the earthquake, even to the point of using it as the occasion to, if possible, restart armed conflict in the area. The United States has so far not lifted its notorious Caesar sanctions, thus prohibiting a full international effort to respond to the catastrophe. In a world now careening to thermonuclear war, the Anglosphere is pursuing a kind of four horsemen diplomacy. Instead of seizing the occasion of the earthquake for potential good, the process of demonization of the Syrian regime continues to the exclusion of the suffering and death of tens of thousands and the displacement of millions. This is Malthusianism in its most brutal form, a kind of four horsemen of the apocalypse diplomacy. War is a form of diplomacy these days. We are all very familiar with that. Famine is used as a weapon against disobedient nations. Pestilence? What about the pestilence of usury, of criminal indebtedness? The most in debt most loudly assert the primacy of their dead and dying monetary system. And then, of course, the fourth horseman, death, the pale horse, which is sort of the metaphor for U.S. policy as a whole, increasingly around the world. We had an exchange on February 6th between a journalist and the spokesman for the government, Ned Price, where a journalist said, "Why not reach out to the Syrian government? They are in power. They're the ones that run these rescue operations. It would be a great gesture. Another gesture would be to sort of lift the sanctions that have basically suffocated Syria." And the answer that Ned Price gave was, "I'm going to resist the temptation to go into your advocacy rather than questioning, but I will make the point that it would be quite ironic, if not even counterproductive, for us to reach out to a government responsible for much of the suffering that they have endured." So these regimes have lost credibility, but more importantly, they've also lost humanity. We are not going to stand for that, and today's assembly is called for the purpose of informing the largest number of people what the actual situation is and what they can do about it. So speaking first today is the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Helga?
Well, I greet you. Obviously, we are in a horrendous situation. What we are facing is the escalation of the war danger, which could, according to the Chinese foreign minister, spiral out of control between NATO and Russia. We are experiencing traumatic developments. Putin, in his annual speech, the sort of State of the Union address, basically suspended the participation of Russia in the START treaty, and that is the final element of the arms negotiation, arms control body, which is now finished. So then we have today a dramatic meeting of the UN Security Council called by Russia, discussing the revelations by Seymour Hersh, who presented a whole bunch of evidence that it was the United States which, in all likelihood, committed the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. So, I only want to touch upon these things to say that all of these developments, however, should not prevent us from putting the spotlight on the unprecedented crisis in Syria, which, is in danger of falling completely between the cracks. What must be done, and this is an appeal to the world community, there must be an immediate humanitarian aid, but that requires that the sanctions which prevent any aid to arrive in Syria in time or in any noteworthy dimension must be immediately lifted, and these sanctions are illegal anyway. So people know there happened a rather severe earthquake on February 6th This was on a 7.8 Richter scale level, and two major earthquakes followed, and even a couple of hours ago, there was still another one. So the death toll, while difficult to know exactly, it's around 50,000 people already in both Turkey and Syria. And while there was international aid to Turkey, the situation in Syria is, due to the sanctions, a total catastrophe. Cardinal Zenari, the papal nuncio, who already had called several years ago that these sanctions must be urgently lifted, because they have led to a situation where, on top of war, on top of a country being torn apart in large part because of Western backing of the rebels, of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, more than 90% of the people are already living in severe poverty, and that was before the earthquake. Now, Cardinal Zenari went to Aleppo, and he reported from there that the temperature is extremely cold. There's no shelter. Many people who left their homes in terror found shelter in religious facilities. They are afraid to go back in their homes because after years of war, all of these homes are severely, weakened by earlier tremors and shooting. And what Cardinal Zenari reports is that many people are so completely desperate, and they're saying, why does this happen to us? We have been living under bombs. We had to endure the rebels. Now these earthquakes. Bombs of poverty are much worse. This is what Zenari called the, effects of the sanctions. So what the Syrian people right now are experiencing is a tragedy within a tragedy. So according to local witnesses, and we will hear some of them later in this program, the sanctions are the reason why the passage of aid is being blocked at the border. So, there is no way how we can allow to have the fate of the Syrian population not in the limelight of the international awareness after 12 years of war, COVID, sanctions, the collapse of the currency, and the latest catastrophe is just more than what people can bear. But we also want to say that, when Cardinal Zenari says that the whole country is engulfed in a sea of pain, and despite the fact that there is some aid coming from Russia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, it is also true what Xavier Bisitz from the Aids to the Church in Need, the ACN, says is there's little, if any, international aid, and there's a complete lack of international support. Now, the main reason for this is the Caesars Act. This is based on a complete fraud. This was uncovered several years ago already by Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone. This was Caesar was the name of this mysterious person who supposedly brought photos from the crimes of the Syrian government against civilians. But this was just a pretext for a regime change operation against the Syrian government, because on these pictures, it was mostly Syrian soldiers who had been killed by terrorists. So this is a fraud, and this fraud must end momentarily. And we call upon you, the people who are watching, that you have to demand that the American Congress immediately lifts these sanctions, because any more day or hour is contributing to the killing of the Syrian people. Now, the real aim of this was spelled out by James Jeffrey, the special envoy to Syria during the Trump administration, who basically said that anybody who wants to reconstruct Syria cannot do that without paying attention to the Caesar sanctions. That basically means never. The unilateral sanctions, in any case, make the question of human rights completely meaningless, It's part of asymmetric warfare. It's a collective punishment of the civilian population. The aim is to make their suffering so unbearable that they will contribute and become an instrument of regime change. So it's completely illegal. You know, it makes the weakest, the old people, the sick people, the children, the women bear the cost of this whole operation. And it is illegal. I think unilateral sanctions should be banned. They violate international law. Now, the only kinds of sanctions which could possibly be legal are those which are adopted by the UN Security Council, and that only if it does not violate the basic right of the population in the affected country. So the sanctions have to go, but then we immediately have to put also on the table the economic reconstruction of Syria. Now, the Schiller Institute already in 2014 presented a project which we called at the time the Phoenix Project, which is a vast program, you know, basically to completely reconstruct the Syrian economy, which now must start with a vast, gigantic housing construction program for the return of the many millions of refugees. I think altogether something like 10 million refugees, if you count the refugees who have gone abroad to neighbor countries, to European countries, also inside Syria. Schools must be reconstructed, hospitals, but also agriculture must be rebuilt, pharmaceutical industry, petrochemical, aerospace, electronics, machine tool. President Assad had the vision in 2009 already of what he called the strategy of the 5 Cs, which was the idea to integrate through a waterway system the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Caspian Ocean, and the Black Sea. And that must become the backbone of the integration of Syria into the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, which now, given the fact that even Saudi Arabia and Turkey have basically applied to be members in the BRICS countries, and that President Xi Jinping has offered the integration of the Mediterranean into the Belt and Road Initiative, that must be put on the agenda immediately. But that does not take away the absolute moral requirement of Europe, of the United States to participate in the reconstruction of Syria. So I want to leave it at that, and we should absolutely mobilize the world population to this effect.
Thank you, Helga. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute, Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted. You've just heard Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder and leader of the Schiller Institute. Our next speaker is Vanessa Beeley. She's a British activist and journalist who has been covering Syria on site. I believe she's there now. Vanessa, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think what I want to try and say tonight is that, of course, the sanctions should be lifted, and effectively the Caesar law is one of the most criminal and vindictive sanctions package that has ever been used or weaponized against a sovereign nation. You mentioned that effectively it prevents any nation coming to the aid of Syria for rebuilding and reconstitution of the country into a workable territory again. But I don't feel personally, and I live in Syria, I've been living here, this is my 4th year, I've been working here for 7 years. For me, the sanctions go hand in hand with the illegal occupation of this country on 3 sectors of its borders. The only friendly border is with Lebanon, and we know that Lebanon also itself is under attack by the Anglosphere to further weaken it so that it's unable or it's not as capable of coming to the full aid of Syria during this attempt to devastate and destroy Syria. The occupation of Syrian territories in the northeast, you have, of course, the United States. alongside its Kurdish Contra proxies. Along the northern border, you have Turkey via its own proxies, which we know, of course, to have been the relabeled Free Syrian Army and Al-Qaeda elements that are occupying a region of northern Syria at the northwest, which is occupied by Al-Qaeda, dominated by Al-Qaeda, which we know to be a US asset. Ambassador Jeffries termed it such during Trump's administration. Jake Sullivan wrote an email to Hillary Clinton in 2012 stating that Al-Qaeda was on the side of the United States during this regime change war. And in the south, of course, we have the historic and illegal annexation of the Golan territories by the Zionist entity. In my view, the occupation of these territories, the occupation of Palestine, is also a priority. The sanctions, in a sense, for me, are a symptoms of the cause. And the cause is the occupation, the illegal occupation of Syrian territory and Palestinian territory. Why do I say this? Because, in all honesty, when I speak to Syrians, the sanctions they can deal with, sanctions have been imposed upon them for decades, including, of course, for their so-called harboring of the PKK labeled terrorists at that point, now, of course, being weaponized by the United States against Syria. You have a situation now where the border crossings into Syria are completely under the control of hostile states, apart from one opening, which is Al-Bukamal in the northeast, which is regularly bombed by the Zionist entity, destroying humanitarian convoys even before the earthquake. And how has the Zionist entity responded to the humanitarian tragedy in Syria? It bombed Syria. In the early hours of the morning of February the 19th, Israeli Zionist warplanes launched missiles at a number of sites in Syria. Imagine this, after an earthquake on the 6th of February, and then multiple aftershocks that have continued the devastation of this country and the trauma and the stress for the population, now rendered homeless again for the second or third time since 2011. Israel, while promising to send aid, is in reality bombing the population here. In Kafr Souze, which is about 15 minutes away from where I live, 5 civilians were killed. An apartment block was irreparably damaged. Now, among those civilians was a cardiologist, a pharmacist, and an engineer. The Iranian Cultural Center is about 3 blocks away from where they targeted. They also targeted Damascus Citadel, an archaeological institute where they have some of the most up-to-date equipment for investigating archaeological sites. And they destroyed a number of historic documents appertaining to the Citadel and also to Damascus. So this is eugenics. This is the destruction and the erasure of cultural identity and heritage by the Zionist entity. And of course, this has been ongoing since 2011. Now, at the same time, somebody alluded quite correctly to the fact that the West is exploiting this tragedy to effectively kickstart the war again against Syria. Why can I say that with some confidence? Because you mentioned in the Northwest that aid is being prevented coming into Syria. Well, no, that's not true. Aid, or rather equipment, is entering the Northwest through the Bab al-Hawa crossing, which is totally controlled by Al-Qaeda. In fact, historically, it has been a revenue provider for Al-Qaeda. Any humanitarian aid entering that border crossing is requisitioned by Al-Qaeda and then sold at extortionate rates to the Syrian population under their occupation. None of this humanitarian aid generally will get to the Syrian people in the areas that they control, that Al-Qaeda control. However, There is now millions of funding being raised for who? For the CIA MI6 White Helmet organization, which we know to be nothing more than an auxiliary of Al-Qaeda and the various splinter armed groups. Literally 85 million from US aid, hundreds of millions pledged by their PR complex in the West. Where is this money going? This money is not coming in for, as they claim, heavy machinery. Leading up to 2022, US aid had already provided $25.2 million in funding for heavy machinery and equipment for the White Helmets. So this funding that is now being raised by the West is effectively to rearm and reinforce the armed groups in the Northwest, to restart the military campaign against now an even more fragile Syrian state. We saw literally 2 days after the first earthquake on the 6th of February, the breakout from Raju prison in the north of Afrin, which is under the control of the Turkish intelligence agencies, of ISIS terrorists that we also know to be for certain a proxy of the United States and its allies in the globalist cartel. And at least 2 attacks have been carried out against civilians in the east of Homs since the earthquake. In both occasions, dozens of civilians were kidnapped. And the last attack, we know that 53 civilians, not military soldiers or armed forces, civilians were murdered while they were truffle hunting to the east of Homs. We know that the United States is effectively now transferring ISIS, as it has been doing, of course, since it's had control of the Northeast. It effectively ferries ISIS backward and forwards across the Iraqi border. Now it's sending them to Ukraine. But we see now that the entire military effort or proxy military effort is being re-energized and resurrected by the West because they see an opportunity to now militarily strike again at Syria. And the attack by the Zionist entity is a part of this campaign. It can't be separated. There are also NGOs in the Northwest, like the Molhan team, which is raising money for the armed groups, we have to assume. And we know now in the last 2 days that Israel has opened a bank account especially to be funding this NGO in the Northwest. So the tentacles of the Zionist entity and the Western, the Anglosphere cabal are now reaching out to try and militarily destroy Syria. The West basically wants Syrians dead, and sanctions have not worked. Syrians are resilient, they're resourceful, and despite the fact that 90% of the population is below the poverty level, they have survived. Now they have, whether it's man-made or it's natural, they have a terrible humanitarian tragedy. 5 million estimated homeless in Syria, Syria real, and even in the Northwest, which, as I said, is under the control of the Western-backed terrorist groups. It is a humanitarian tragedy, but the West is not helping. Who is coming to the aid of Syrians? Russia, Iran, Algeria, Armenia, Venezuela, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hashd al-Shabi from Iraq. The allies, the non-aligned bloc, effectively has defied the Caesar sanctions and has not been punished for it so far. Of course, we don't know what will happen in the future. But I think what it has done is to draw the battle lines. It's drawn the lines where we can see very clearly the countries that are prepared to challenge US, Zionist, and UK, EU hegemony in the region. And what Syria needs now is, yes, for the sanctions to be lifted, but more than anything, it needs American US occupation ended. Not forgetting, of course, that they also occupy the southeast in their Al-Tanef military base, which also controls the Rukban refugee camp, has established a 55-kilometer no entry zone around it, where it's training and arming armed groups, including ISIS. So end the occupation, please.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute, Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted. You've just heard Vanessa Beeley, a British activist, journalist, reporting directly from Syria. Our next speaker is Colonel Richard Black, former head of the United States Army Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, former Virginia State Senator. Colonel Black, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I want to just recap for our listeners a little bit about the origins of the Syrian war. This was not a domestic uprising in any respect. The United States planned and instigated the war from the outset. In 2007, which was 4 years before the war actually began, WikiLeaks intercepted a 2007 cable where the U.S. Embassy in Damascus was describing in detail how we could overthrow the government. And one of the key things that they proposed was that we foster religious hatred between the Shia and Sunni Muslims, and that would have a very destabilizing effect on the country. And indeed, that turned out to be the case. In 2011, 3 months before the war began in Syria, the United States, UK, and France launched an unprovoked attack against Libya. We captured their huge arsenal of weapons. We sent those weapons to Turkey, which then funneled them across the border to the Islamic terrorists who were destabilizing the nation. By 2012, just shortly after the beginning of the war, within a year, the CIA was already channeling weapons to all Syrian terrorists. There were mountains of weapons being sent from warehouses that were built secretly by the Central Intelligence Agency across the border inside of Turkey. President Obama authorized this under covert program Timber Sycamore. The terrorists who conducted the uprising against the legitimate government of Syria employed a doctrine of horror. The doctrine of horror was the notion that if you could create such paralyzing fear among the people, they would simply give up and they would not resist. Our biggest proxies throughout this war have been Al-Qaeda in Syria, which has gone through a number of names, al-Nusra, Tahrir al-Sham, and sort of this blur of names designed to confuse the public. But they have been our principal ally during the war. Al-Qaeda in Syria. Al-Qaeda, the same group that flew the jets into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on 9/11, killing 3,000 Americans here in this country. These were the groups that we now allied ourselves with just 10 years after 9/11. The doctrine of horror was so grisly and so barbaric that it was not possible for the CIA to directly supply weapons to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. For that reason, we funneled tanks, artillery, missiles, all sorts of heavy advanced weapons in massive quantities. We transferred them, we sold them to Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar for the express purpose of arming Al-Qaeda and ISIS. There was no crime that was too hideous for us to support. Our ultimate goal throughout this was to create a neo-colonial empire with the United States at its head, in which we could control all of the oil and gas resources of the Middle East. And we set about that in part through invading Iraq, which was an unprovoked war, has resulted in the loss of 1 or 2 million people. Syria has been the major stumbling block for NATO and the Western powers and what they're trying to do. Now, throughout this war in Syria, the media have been complicit in the war crimes that have dominated the war, and they have portrayed the terrorists as nice fellows who simply want a little more democracy. The fact is that all of these groups have have come forward and they have said very publicly that their desire was to impose a radical Islamic state, which would be governed by 8th century Sharia law. So the entire media narrative has been completely false. The doctrine of horror employed as one of his key weapons mass rape. Now, we hear a lot of allegations about rape, that this happens, that happens, and there are rapes that occur as incidents of war. The difference is that in Syria, mass rape was employed as a fundamental element of the terrorist doctrine. It was the idea that you could plant your seeds within all of the women of the nation, and that would advance your cause. And you could also create this sense of paralyzing fear. Many Syrian women committed suicide rather than be gang raped by jihadists when they knew that the terrorists were about to come through. The incidence of rape has been so horrific in Syria that the government, the legislature, and the president found it necessary to enact new laws modifying the traditional Islamic approach on paternity so that the rapist would not have paternal rights over the children of the women that they impregnated through rape. There was a case in which one of the jihadist war leaders used to take a 13-year-old slave that he held, a girl. He would strip her naked and he would tie her to the windshield of his Humvee, his American Humvee, that he drove into battle. And he did this knowing that the Syrian Arab army, which is very disciplined, very fine troops, that they would not shoot at a poor, sobbing girl who was tied to his windshield. Now, the Syrian people never, at any stage during this 11-year war, have come behind any of the leaders that the United States has proposed. Not a single one has achieved widespread popularity with the people of Syria. The people of Syria back Bashar al-Assad, their president. They have elected him, they have reelected him, and they want their freedom. They want their constitution. Now, Syria has the only constitution among all of the Arab countries that provides guarantees of religious freedom. I've read the Constitution. It guarantees religious freedom in 3 places. It guarantees women's rights. It is the most modern of all of the constitutions, and yet of all things, it is criticized. The United States has Saudi Arabia do the major criticism of the Syrian constitution, and here is Saudi Arabia, which has no constitution. It operates under a vicious Sharia law, and they're criticizing Syria for not having a sufficiently liberal constitution. Quite absurd. Well, what happened? The Syrian people, through enormous force of will, here's a small country of 23 million people who confronted 2/3 of the world's military and industrial might, determined to crush them, hoping to tear apart pieces of their flesh and to accumulate whatever wealth they could. And yet Syria fought off all of these countries, all of the NATO countries, all of the Western countries. So what happened is in 2016, by the grace of God, the Syrian army began to drive back. They defeated ISIS. They pushed them out of Palmyra first. Later, they pushed them out of Aleppo in a great battle that was reminiscent of the tremendous World War II battle at Stalingrad, where Hitler's forces finally lost the battle at Stalingrad, and that was the beginning of the end. The loss of Aleppo, which had been fought over for 4 years, was the beginning of the end for the Syrian terrorists. And at that point, John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State under Barack Obama, was absolutely furious. He saw ISIS and Al-Qaeda being pushed back, seeing them lose the initiative. And at that point, he announced that the United States would now implement Plan B. Plan B was designed where the United States would invade Syria in the northern part. Northern Syria is the breadbasket of the entire country. That's where the wheat is grown, and it also is the primary source of oil for heating and for transportation. John Kerry's Plan B was designed to capture that, which we did. We landed American troops, we occupied, we fought against the Syrian army in many respects. We provided air support to ISIS forces in the battle at Deir ez-Zor and allowed ISIS to cut apart the defenders, heroic defenders at Deir ez-Zor in a 2-hour airstrike by American troops, followed immediately by an enormous attack by ISIS troops who were preparing and had coordinated with the United States in that battle. We now, by virtue of the United States occupying all of northern Syria, knocking out the opposition from Deir ez-Zor, even though it was never captured by ISIS, but we diminished its strength, and we occupied all of this. What did we do? We had two objectives in seizing the north. The first was to impose widespread famine on the entire country, to create starvation, to create childhood malnutrition. The other objective was to freeze to death the Syrian people, particularly the elderly people who were more vulnerable to being exposed, with all of the buildings having been blown down by American weapons throughout this 11-year war. Plan B has been effective, but Plan B needed another facet, and that was the Caesar sanctions. The United States imposed a military naval blockade, and using that blockade, we have imposed these absolutely inhuman sanctions that were designed to prevent Syria from rebuilding. There was a specific provision of the Caesar sanctions that punishes anyone who helps in the rebuilding effort. We wanted the people to remain living in rubble, exposed to the cold, freezing, starving. This was the objective of the Caesar sanctions. The last lifeline that we could figure out to destroy was that there were some Syrian businesses and business interests that did their banking in Lebanon. We orchestrated, we don't know all of the details of it, but shortly after Mike Pompeo declared that we were going to tighten these sanctions like they'd never been tightened, shortly afterwards there was a mysterious explosion of a ship carrying ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which is explosive. It exploded and devastated Beirut harbor, killing many people, wounding a mass of thousands of people. And in the process, we managed to collapse Lebanon's banking system and destroy all of the wealth of the businesses from Syria. There is no crime that is too hideous for the United States to participate in, And what we are seeing occurring now is a continuation of the horror that has been going on. I'm going to give just one example in closing. Now, this has been going on, and there are 1,000 like this, but I will not show this photo, but I will describe it. It is too grisly to show. This was the massacre at Al-Zora. In Al-Zora, the group called Tahrir al-Sham seized a small Alawite village. They went through, and what this photo shows, there was very little resistance in the village. It had a few militiamen, and they were faced by this large force of Al-Qaeda cutout people. This picture shows a small room, which was apparently used by mothers to teach their children their school lessons. And on the floor are 3 bodies, as near as I can tell. There may be 4 women, young ladies, very, very light-skinned, European in appearance. These are Alawite women. They're known as the Friends of the Christians. And the woman in the foreground, lying dead, she has light reddish hair, pale-skinned, looks very European. There is one of the jihadists. This is an American-supplied armed jihadist standing with his boot on her still warm and bleeding body. And in the background, there is a horrific amount of blood spatter. This isn't just like someone throwing a glass of blood. This is spray from bullets slamming into the bodies of these young mothers. And there's another woman laying on her side, her face streaming with blood. And then there's a third whose face doesn't show. And there are 2 jihadists proudly parading, and the one has his boot stamped heavily on the back of the young red-headed woman, and he's taking a selfie of himself. They killed reportedly some 43 of the women and children in Al-Zara that day. They kidnapped another 70 and sold them into sex slavery. I received oral reports that they took the children in the village, that they tied them to the fence in the village, that they made them watch as they tortured and executed many of their parents. And afterwards, they went to the children who were tied to the fence, sobbing, pleading, begging for mercy. They doused them with gasoline, they lit fire to them, and they burned them to death. This is the character of the people that we have supported. The United States and the West have supported these people throughout 11 years of war with our singular determination that we will topple the freest, most liberal nation in the Arab world, Syria, and that we will turn it over to people like this who take selfies standing on the backs of innocent women. It is disgraceful. And now we're following up by taunting the people of Syria who are under this terrible earthquake devastation, and we're taunting them about how they really should have gone the other way. They should have been on our side, and now they're getting what they deserve, is essentially what the State Department is saying. It is a disgrace. It is a horror. If the American people understood what is happening, this government would fall. This government could not exist in the United States if the American people were not shielded by this complicit media in the horrors that we have imposed on the Syrian people. Thank you.
And thank you, Colonel Black. If you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute. Syrian sanctions must be lifted. You've just heard Colonel Richard Black, former head of the United States Army Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon. And our next speaker is Marwa Osman, author on the military diplomacy platform, university lecturer, and host of the political show, The Middle East Stream, broadcast on Al Atija English channel. So, hello. Glad to see you.
Thank you, but it's not on Al Atija, it's on Press TV, and I don't publish anything on any military sites. Let's be clear about that. Thank you for giving me the platform. I am a university professor, as well as assistant professor for media studies at Ma'arif University and the Lebanese International University. Now, concerning why we are here today is to talk about the excruciating sanctions suffocating the Syrian people since 2011 up until today. Now, to add salt to the injury, we saw the natural disaster that hit the northern part of Syria and the coast as well, which brought upon light towards these sanctions that hindered the Syrian government from taking care of its own people throughout these years, and especially after this earthquake. But I would like to give an example of what the sanctions really are, because we say sanctions, but we don't know where they hit exactly inside Syria. And I would like to point out that everything that we read 8 days after the earthquake coming from the United States of America saying that it is lifting the sanctions on Syria is a big lie, and I will explain why. Basically, let me explain what are the sanctions that have been hitting Syria, the accumulative effect, it's been since 2011, and the effect after the disaster. Basically, what happened is the United States of America decided that it wanted to sanction everything that's related to the Syrian government. Now, the people in the West might think that sanctioning the elite in the government in Syria means sanctioning the president and his wife and the ministers, but that's not the case alone, because what they did is they sanctioned everything included in the government of Syria. And in Syria, if you don't know, everything is actually organized and coordinated and managed by the government, including the education system, the system of health, and everything that's related to the daily lives of the Syrian people. Because if you're sick, you basically go to a doctor, the doctor refers you to a hospital, you go to the hospital, you get the necessary surgery that you need. This is an example. What happened is that the impact of the US and the Western sanctions was basically obstructing the rapid response for this tragedy, but it had repercussions coming before that. And for basically two reasons. We have first the cumulative effect, and then we have the current effect. Talk about the cumulative effect that has been going on in Syria since 2011, which basically hindered the efforts of the governmental institutions in their efforts to try, firstly, to rehabilitate and repair what happened during the war in Syria, specifically in the areas hit by the tragedy of the earthquake. You have direct sanctions on energy and construction and reconstruction sectors inside Syria, and on the banking sector inside Syria. What does that mean? Means that the country, Syria, is prevented from basically securing its needs in modern machinery. That's why we saw people under the rubble up until they're still there, up until now, because there's no necessary machinery to bring the people from under the rubble. They don't have these machinery parts, they don't have spare parts, they don't have technical support. And accordingly, these sectors were not in a position to deal with the repercussions of the earthquake without any international support. Now here, when the US says that it lifted the sanctions, that's a lie, because no money was being able to be wired into the banking system of Syria to directly help the people affected, because that was basically annulled, that was not included in the latest statement issued by the Treasury. They said that there's this certain section, I think it's called Section B, if I'm not mistaken, it's exempted from the lifting of these sanctions, which means they did absolutely nothing, because you can't send money to help the people, to fund the aid, to fund the relief for the people, to try and fund construction for the buildings that fell. So that's number one. Then you have the exchange rate of the Syrian lira, because it decreased significantly during the years, but basically because of the tightening of the US blockade and the sanctions of the so-called Caesar's Act, you saw that the country For example, in 2019, the exchange rate was 400 plus Syrian lira, which means $1 was equal almost 500 Syrian lira. But now $1 equals 6,800 Syrian lira, and the salaries are still the same. Can you imagine that? This decline left direct and also indirect effects on the country's ability to secure basic needs like food, like medicine, like oil derivatives, like technical equipment and others, because, you know, globally also the price of oil was increasing. So that would put a lot of burden on the Syrian government itself to try and secure oil, because it cannot get to its own oil because the United States of America is sitting on it to protect it, as we all know, because the biggest two oil fields, Conoco oil fields and Al Omar oil fields, which are Syrian oil fields located in the eastern part of the Euphrates, are completely under the control of the United States of America, where it has been looting this very resourceful, important sector in the Syrian economy and selling it and using none other than ISIS and its also friends of these so-called the SDF, known as the Kurdish separatists in the eastern part of Syria, to sell that oil either through Turkey or through Iraq. So you're not allowing Syria to get it, you are stealing it and selling it elsewhere. And then you have also one of the cumulative effects of these sanctions is the high cost of importing goods and materials, because the higher risk of dealing with Syria, because the US is practically threatening any other entity, state, or company outside of Syria to deal with Syria on the inside, which makes everything just explode in prices, which, by the way, these sanctions basically it contributed to an increase of about 50 to 60% in the cost of items that are being basically imported into Syria, because the food and the drug sector are the most present here. For example, when the West talks about excluding them from the sanctions, that is the biggest lie, because they are directly affected with other sanctions, like sanctions on oil. Because how can you operate a hospital if you don't have diesel fuel for electricity? Can you imagine people getting sick, going to the hospital, and then ending up having no electricity under the surgery while under the knife, because there's no enough oil derivatives to cover the facilities, the operating facilities in that hospital? Added to that, the education as well was severely hit since 2011, because if you don't have diesel fuel, you don't have a bus that would take kids to school, which means a lot of a percentage of illiteracy is now happening, or has been happening for the past 11 years. Now, for the second reason, now we spoke about the accumulated effects of the US sanctions since 2011, which led to the inability of the Syrian government to work with this new disaster. Now, if we want to talk about what's happening right now, since February 6 up until now, the US sanctions weakened Syria to respond, to help the people in the repercussions of the earthquake and the aftermath of the earthquake as well, because every time there's an aftermath, the last one was last night and was horrifying. We felt it here in Lebanon and it was horrifying. I cannot imagine how the people of Aleppo, Latakia, Idlib, Hama, and Jable felt when they were hit. I think it was the 6th or 7th time with such a major aftershock, while they don't have anything, while living in tents or living in like facilities like schools or open areas. So the US administration has been very keen to spread around the world over the past years the horror and the terror of, if you deal with Syria, if you try to help Syria, then we will be at your door. We will not allow you. We will sanction you. That's also part of the sanctions that were not lifted. And the biggest evidence is that after the US decided to say we're lifting sanctions for 180 days, we didn't see any plane of aid and relief from the European Union, for example, from the biggest allies of the US, landing in Syria, whether in Aleppo or in Damascus, to give relief and aid to the Syrian people. We saw an Italian airplane land right here in Beirut, which means they would have to load off all the help for like 2 or 3 hours and then put them in trucks and then drive for 12 hours to Aleppo, or for like 9 hours to Latakia, which means you're already delaying the help that the Syrians literally need at the moment. The reluctance of most of the influential companies in many disciplines, in many sectors, to cooperate and to deal with the Syrian government in order to help Syria reconstruct, in order to help Syria help the damaged buildings right now, reconstruct them, or help build new homes, at least temporary homes for the people who lost their houses. They often require dealing with a third party in order to get help to Syria, for example, like what happened with Italy and Lebanon. If you are a company, if you are a country, at least you're a non-Syrian port or a non-Syrian airport. And even after that, you might find it hard to even get in there because you might get sanctions when you return, because they will say, we were tracking where you were going, even though you offloaded your help or your aid or whatever Syria wanted to buy in Lebanon, but that ended up going into Syria, which means now you're breaking the Caesar's Act, which means you're going to be sanctions. So they are basically working like gangsters against any entity or state that would dare come and help Syria. Unfortunately, this network of fear has reached the companies and the institutions, even those who support Syria politically. I'll give you an example. Just hours after the earthquake hit Syria on Monday, I tried contacting many of the Lebanese NGOs that I trust, that are not funded by US aid. I tried contacting them and asking them if they would provide banking accounts that we could send to our friends who live abroad, where they can send aid, and then that NGO in Lebanon can take that money and physically take it to Syria, because we cannot wire it because of the sanctions. I cannot tell you how many NGOs sadly refused, while they are very much hurt, because they said, if we allow this to happen, if we give you our accounts and we allow people to send aid in the name of relief for Syria, then we will be sanctioned and we will not be able to help the Lebanese people who severely need help by many NGOs right now because of the economic and financial disaster that Lebanon is going through. So governments are afraid of economic cooperation. NGOs are afraid of sending aid to and relief to Syria before the earthquake, after the earthquake, even though they said they removed the sanctions. And I just explained why that's not the case. The most important example of this, for example, before the earthquake, was Washington completely refused to grant Egypt a written permit to allow it to give Lebanon electricity and gas via Syrian territory, because they can't give it otherwise. They refused. Now, after they removed the sanctions, some of the Lebanese ministers tried to talk through with the Egyptians to try and get that permit from the Americans, and they still refused, which basically is beyond what a human being can fathom. I mean, look, despite the seriousness of the long negative impact of all these Western sanctions on the Syrian economy, because it's not a US sanction, it's sanctions of the US et al. The friends of the US have a big hand in allowing these suffocating sanctions to continue against the people in Syria. The results, it does have a very big impact. The lifting of these sanctions can contribute within maybe a short period of time in achieving positive results that will have impact on the lives and the livelihoods of the population. But we need quick restoring of the country's needs for commodities, especially in the food and health sector. But why am I not a bit hopeful that this will be the case, or that will how it's going to work? Because I don't believe anymore in anything called an international community that could help Syria out. I cannot be put in a place to pledge and to say that, or to plead, or to ask our friends even in the West to talk to their own regimes to try and break the sanctions on Syria. That never worked. That's not going to work even now at the worst time that Syria is passing through in this disaster. But I think the best way to help Syria right now is to defy American hegemony against the entire region of West Asia. How can that be defied? The same way Algeria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, war-torn Yemen sent aid to Syria. They found a way, and they did send aid to Syria. The only way is to defy these Western hegemony acts against Syria, against Lebanon, against Iraq as well, because we also, just like Vanessa was saying, even before the earthquake, the only border between Iraq and Syria was always bombed by the United States of America, because they don't want to allow any form of aid to come to Syria. Well, they can't stop us anymore, because now we're more than one. We're more than two. It's no longer just Iraq and Lebanon. It's Iraq, Lebanon, Algeria, Egypt, the UAE, Jordan. It's a lot of countries that are contributing right now to aid and help Syria. And also, I think the UN Charter clearly states that when a country is under occupation, that country has full right for resistance. And I only think that what the US understands is power. And without power, the United States of America will never leave Syria alone. Hence why what I think will happen, because of the Friends of Syria and the Syrian Arab Army and the also affiliates of the Syrian Arab Army, which are the resistance fighters of certain areas, Syrians in certain areas in Syria that help the Syrian army, which called the Lejan Shabiya, the national guards of certain areas in Syria. I think they have the capability and they have the technology, and they definitely have the desire to see the US occupation leave. And the only way they can leave is if they taste the same medicine that they have been giving Syria for the past 13 years. You bomb, you're going to get bombed back. Thank you.
Okay, if you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute, Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted. You've just heard Marwa Osman of Lebanon, author, university lecturer, journalist, and TV show host for Press TV and Midstream One. Our next speaker is Chandra Muzaffar of Malaysia, the president of Movement for a Just World, an Islamic reformist and activist. Hello.
Hello. Moderator, friends, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Schiller Institute for this very kind invitation. In particular, Helga LaRouche and my dear friend, Mike Billington. I'm happy that I accepted this invitation. I've learned a great deal, much more than I've learned from books and from my interaction with Syrians and others who know the Syrian situation well. I've learned much more this evening through the interventions of people like Vanessa Beeley, Colonel Black, Marwa Osman, apart from the presentation of Helga LaRouche. It has been an evening, that's the time zone here, it's actually early morning, which has been saturated with facts, with analysis, with insights, which you don't get from the mainstream media or even the alternative media. And this, I think, is the role that the Schiller Institute is playing, which is really remarkable. It is something which deserves the accolades of all of us. I would like to make 3 points in this brief presentation. First, I agree that we can only understand sanctions within the context of the larger situation. The occupation of various countries in West Asia, the occupation brought about to some extent by Israel and the role that Israel and the Zionist entity has played in this occupation, that I think is very, very important, something that one has to understand, that this is the focus that we must keep in our mind all the while when we look at the situation in Syria. Sanctions by themselves, they're oppressive. Sanctions are suffocating. Sanctions are dehumanizing. Sanctions are a slur upon our dignity as human beings. We know all that. But sanctions wouldn't mean a thing without occupation. It is the larger occupation of the region for a purpose that we must always keep in mind, and that is the second point that I want to make. We must understand that occupation continues in West Asia for certain reasons, but that occupation is linked to hegemony. The desire of the United States and its allies to maintain hegemony, global dominance. That is the biggest challenge that we face. The biggest challenge that we face in international relations today and for the last few decades, since the end of the Second World War, is US-led hegemony. If that hegemony does not end, there'd be no freedom for human beings anywhere. It would not be possible for people to regain their dignity. And this is why Syria is important. It is a victim of that hegemony, which is why we have to fight that hegemony in relation to particular dimensions of that hegemony as they express themselves and impact upon the Syrian people. Sanctions will be one of them. This determined drive by the hegemon to bring about regime change in Syria, which is again linked to this desire for hegemony. And why, you would ask? Why do they want to do this? I think some of the previous speakers had alluded to the real reason. Because Syria is independent. It wants to maintain its independence. It refuses to yield to hegemony. It refuses to succumb to the power of the mighty. And this is what the hegemon does not want. It's not because Syria has committed any crime as such. Yes, it supports Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is an organization, a movement fighting for the freedom of the Lebanese people, for their self-determination, because you know the parts of Lebanon continue to be occupied. True, Syria is on the side of Hamas. Hamas is a freedom fighter. We may or may not agree with all the tactics they use at different points in time, but we cannot run away from the fact that it is committed to the freedom of the Palestinian people and the freedom of other Arab people. So self-determination is a vital element in the struggle. Self-determination is the antithesis of hegemony. You cannot have self-determination, nations shaping their own future, nations upholding their sovereignty in a situation where hegemony is all powerful, which is why I think this principle of sovereignty, of self-determination, of the freedom of individual nation states, to which the Schiller Institute is committed and to which the late LaRouche was committed. It is a very important dimension of international relations, and we must keep that in mind all the while. So this is the point one would like to make, that there is a larger struggle that is taking place. And the reason why we have to focus upon sanctions at this point in time is because it highlights certain dimensions of this, but it is not the only problem that they face. There is occupation, there is the challenge of regime change, there are all the other dimensions that we should also be conscious of. But as far as sanctions go, let's not forget that the third most severely sanctioned country in the world at this moment is Syria. It's a small country of 23 million people, but it is the third most severely sanctioned country in the world. And why? Because it wants to be independent. It wants to determine its own future. And this is the price it has been forced to pay. Friends, we also have to remember that for Syria and the Syrian people today, it is not just the question of sanctions as we understand it. It is a fragmented, fractured nation, which makes the situation much, much worse. It is a state which is not able to function as a state because large parts of Syria have been taken over by others. There are 5, 6, 7 different groups that are fighting for power within Syria itself. And some of them are backed by the US, other allies, and by some of the countries in that region. And some of the backers of these groups are fully aware that the groups themselves are terrorist groups. Al-Qaeda and other affiliated groups. They're all part of this mess that is Syria. We must keep that in mind also. Sanctions, but more than sanctions, a fractured, fragmented country. And whatever one may say about Syria, of course, there are shortcomings in the Syrian government, which we cannot run away from. There are issues that they have to handle, but what one cannot deny that in 3 respects, Syria has done better than many other countries in that region. One, Syria has been able to provide for a long while, before 2011, before the turbulence and the turmoil of the last few years, Syria has been able to provide a good healthcare system and an education system for its people. It has outdone many of the other countries, richer countries in the region, through its healthcare service. And that, I think, is very, very important. That it is a government which has cared for the people. And the healthcare program is a good example of this. It is an education program, an attempt to provide free, affordable education to its own people. And this is something that we tend to ignore, that I think is very sad. And number two, we commend Syria also because it is a country where women play a major role compared to some of its neighbors. Women are important in Syrian society. Don't forget that the special advisor in political affairs to the president is a woman. And women have held very high positions in Syrian society. Well, not just at the level of leadership. If you look at other levels of Syrian society, women have been important. It is a society which has, and it's related to this point that I'm making about women, which has an approach to Islam which is liberating. It is not the sort of approach that one associates with certain other countries in the region. It is a liberating approach towards Islam, what some Syrian scholars would call Islam el-Shami, something that is part of its history and its tradition. Open, inclusive, an approach that is universal, that brings out the essence of Islam. And that leads me to the third point I want to make about Syria, which is remarkable. 10% of its population is Christian. Syria has had good relations between Muslims and Christians for a very, very long while. It is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, which in spite of all the pulls and pressures of the region, in spite of all the things that we have witnessed in other parts of West Asia and North Africa, Syria has been able to sustain this open approach to religion and at the same time to establish good relations amongst different people. This is the one place where you'll have Christians walking into a mosque and you'll have the Muslims walking into a church, and where communities interact very well with each other. The head of John the Baptist, as you know, is kept in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. And both Christians and Muslims, they know what it means, and there's tremendous respect for these shared values of their history. Now, isn't it amazing that it is this sort of society where there's a certain degree of inclusiveness, of universality, of good relations between communities, a society which looks after the poor and gives priority to the health of the poor and the dispossessed. That is this society that is being targeted by the United States of America and its allies. By this we mean the elite, not the American people as such. But the American people don't know these things about Syria and about what is happening there. That it is this society that is being targeted, and what is worse, as our previous speakers have so eloquently shown us, the United States of America is supporting vicious terrorist groups who are disgrace to religion, to any religion, who are at the same time a disgrace to humanity. They're supporting them in order to perpetuate their goal of hegemony, of dominance, in order to perpetuate the grip upon that region for its oil and gas. Syria does not have much of oil and gas, but it's still a country that does produce oil and gas. They want to grip the region tighter, partly because the Zionist entity is there, and it serves their interests, just as the US is able to perpetuate Israel's interests. That's the other reason. And the other factor that is seldom talked about is strategic. Don't forget that West Asia is the only part of the world where 3 continents meet in that region. And it's strategic. The Mediterranean, the Suez, very, very important for anyone who wants to dominate and control the world. But we believe, and this has been our position all along, that rather than dominate and control, we should cooperate and work together. Different communities, different religions, different nationalities. We should be able to bring about a different world, a more just world, a world where true humanity flourishes, where reason flourishes, where the finest values of our respective civilizations would be able to flourish. And this has to be the goal of the whole of humanity as we struggle for Syria and its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. What we're going to now do is bring people up onto screen. We do have another speaker, Mike Robinson, but he is having some internet problems. And so what we're going to do is go right to discussion. So we'll bring up everyone together. Okay, we have Vanessa Beeley there, and we have Chandra Osman, and we have also Colonel Black, Helga, and Marwa Osman. So Helga, you have anything that you'd like to say now that you've heard everybody as a whole?
Well, I want to thank all the speakers, because it is that kind of from the ground, on the ground reporting, which is what is completely lacking. You would never hear what you heard today in any of the Western media. And I think that that is part of the way how this hegemony functions, that people are just not aware of these things. So we will make a big commitment to get this program out as widely as we can. And we should discuss, more plans. And I'm open to all kinds of suggestions from the other speakers of what you advise, what we should do. Because, in a certain sense, Yemen is another such case, which Beasley from the World Food Program has produced this unbelievable video that the world can look at that, or look at what happens in Afghanistan. So I think it's really time that we find a way to, end this horror show. And I think what is right now happening to the Syrian people should be absolutely front and center stage everywhere.
Let me now ask if any of the speakers have anything that they'd like to add or question at all before we then go to some questions. We have questions, but just want to give you any opportunity.
Well, I'll just add, I must say it's quite an honor to be with this group. Listening to each of the comments has been so enlightening. I think from a global perspective, I love my country. I've probably been in more desperate combat than any general in the Pentagon today. But looking at it from a global perspective, I think we have so overplayed our hand that we risk creating a linkage between Russia and China that is so massive and powerful that it's going to diminish the strength of the West, unless we simply say we really don't need to be at war with everybody. We don't need to be conquering everybody. We can cooperate. China's not attacking us. Russia's not attacking us. But yet here we are. And, there is a long-standing military concept that if you ever link together nations within the Eurasian landmass where they're not vulnerable to interdiction of their oil supply by sea, that you may very well shift the control of the entire world. And I think we are, through very short-sighted geopolitical strategy, driving China and Russia together in ways that really are a little bit unnatural, but we're forcing them. Russia needs to sell its natural resources. China needs to insulate itself from naval blockade, which we did with Japan during the Second World War. They fear the same thing. They can do this through a land bridge. And I think it's just so unfortunate that instead of saying, look, let's trade, let's compete, let's sometimes have disagreements, like we during the Trump administration, I think we had some valid concerns with trade with China, but then that sort of transformed into this atmosphere of hatred and aggression that has sort of seized all of the Western countries. I don't think Trump ever intended that. I think he intended to basically make a little better deal with China than what we had. But we risk making a geopolitical blunder of really monumental proportions. And I think Syria was part of it. This whole scheme to overtake the Middle East by military force has been, in many ways, a great failure. And it has drained the moral strength of America to where now it really is the East that is morally ascendant, and we are in a moral decline. It is a shame. I hate to see it because I love my country. I want it to be a better place, and it was when I was growing up, and I have hope and prayer that it will become better, but we could certainly start by ending these obscene Caesar sanctions that are imposing famine and freezing on innocent people.
Okay. We have a questioner or comment from someone, I think Mark Taliano, independent investigative reporter, author of the book Voices of Syria. He's with us. Okay, Mark. Hi.
Oh, hi. Well, it's a privilege to be in this company. The truth that has been coming from my screen is just unprecedented. And if speakers like Vanessa and Marwa and Senator Black were mainstream, we would have far less war and misery. And Chandra and LaRouche, the Schiller Institute, and I agree that our media is very complicit in all of this for hiding the truth from people, for hiding the fact that our governments, including the Canadian government, support ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria and beyond, that the war on terror is a fraud, that our governments are responsible for these massacres and for this illegal, unilateral, coercive measures that are creating such impoverishment and mass homicide, really, because all of this is intended. Mass homicide of multitudes of people. And I think that if we were to go back to our roots and honor international law the way it should be honored and honor the UN Charter the way it should be honored, that none of this would be happening. And I think that each speaker here is aware of that and has done fantastic work to make this happen for the sake of all of us. And so I'm very thankful that to hear everyone speak, Vanessa, Marwa, and Senator Black, I've heard you speak many, many times, all of you. Every time you speak, you're telling the truth. And it's a beacon of light and justice when I hear that. And it makes me think that if more people are exposed to this, and it is happening slowly, not fast enough, if more people are exposed to this, then there is hope. Getting back to specifics with regard to these unilateral coercive measures, I think, and I agree with, I think Vanessa said this, that we have to go to more to the root causes. I think, and Marwa said this too, the occupation of Syria has to end. The misery will not end until the Western occupation ends. It's illegal. And it should not be tolerated.
You mean the U.S. occupation?
You use it, what did I say? The U.S. occupation of Syria.
Said the Russian occupation.
Sorry. The Russian occupation. Russia was invited into Syria. Thank you for correcting me. Russia was invited in. They're legitimate, and they have done good things. Iran is legitimate. They were invited in by the sovereign country. The United States and the West were not invited in. They are illegal occupiers. Thank you for that correction. They are illegal occupiers and sowing misery throughout the area. And it's backfiring on them, as Senator Black just pointed out. It is backfiring, even from their world domination hegemonic position. That ain't working. The best way is to follow the truth, which each speaker here honors the truth, follow international law. We don't need a rules-based order. Who makes the rules? We don't even know what the rules are. Follow the truth, international law, and the Charter of the United Nations. And thank you for correcting me, Marwa. I make mistakes sometimes. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone have any response to Mark, other than what we heard? Go ahead, Marwa.
I just wanted to say one thing, commenting on what Senator Black was saying concerning the Trump era. I want to remind everyone that Trump was the person who actually brought the sanctions, the Caesars Act, into Syria, and he was the one who blatantly assassinated one of the most important people in the axis of resistance in the region, which generated the first military retaliation against one of the U.S. bases in the world after the World War II, when Iran retaliated on the Ain al-Assad air base as a retaliation for the assassination of the one of the biggest men in the axis of resistance, who had the biggest role in eliminating Daesh, ISIS, in many of the areas in Syria. But to emphasize why this is important, it is because sometimes our friends who are friends of Syria in the United States of America, who are on the conservative side, who are against Joe Biden, basically against the Democrats, they usually think that it was better under the Trump administration. No, it was actually worse. Now with the Biden administration, they're just more busy with what's going on in Ukraine, but at the same time, they're still having time to loot what's found inside Syria and to drop thermal bombs on the crops and the wheat of the Syrian people. So if sanctions are not killing them, actual starvation would kill them. I just wanted to say that, and thanks again for giving me a chance to be a part of this panel.
Oh, I'm sorry. Vanessa, were you going to say something? It's muted.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually add to that the fact that under Trump, I saw very much as bringing in the economic battering ram against Syria. Under the Trump administration, the Caesar Act was imposed. And also, we shouldn't forget that under Trump, the American forces inside Syria were actually dropping thermal balloons onto the wheat crops in the northeast and decimating, or there were vast, intentionally started forest fires and crop fires across Syria under the Trump administration. Also started in the south by Israel, so there was coordination between the states and Israel under the Trump administration to effectively cut off the head, as Marwa said, of the primary resistance against the US-backed ISIS, because it wasn't only Soleimani, it was also Mohandes, who was the leader of the PMU, the Iraqi forces, often described as an Iranian proxy, but in reality, Iraqi non-sectarian. They consisted of Christians, Yazidis, Sunni Islamists, and so on, and who were responsible, in fact, for the defense of Baghdad. So I don't think it makes a single difference if it's Democrat or Republican. The roadmap is the same, and the roadmap is written by the deep state and by the billionaire complex that are now controlling world government anyway, and who see Syria as a gateway to Eurasia, as of course also described by Brzezinski in the Grand Chessboard in 97, which is one of the reasons we have to remember that Syria is being targeted since its independence from the French Mandate in 1946, is because of its collaboration and its alliance with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and then with Russia. The CIA and MI6 interference in Syrian sovereign affairs since 1946 was unerringly to depose governments that they considered to be close to the communist regime of the Soviet Union. So this alliance with Russia, and of course that tips also into Ukraine, and we're coming up to the anniversary of the special military operation. And so I think what we're seeing now is a concerted effort by the West to capitalize on the earthquake to, in their view, finish Syria, because by finishing Syria, they open up the gateway to Eurasia in Syria for the West, and they kick Russia out of the picture. So we're at a very, very pivotal time at the moment. And I have to stress this. I don't think it makes any difference, Republican or Democrat, they're going to follow the same roadmap.
Okay, we have a question from one young person. Kynan has asked a question. He says, thank you to all the panelists in shedding light on the tragic situation in Syria, along with the devastating situation affecting Syria, Yemen, and other parts of the world, which refuse to submit to the dictates of the rules-based order. We're now being mentally prepared for direct nuclear conflict with Russia and China. What can the average citizen do to bring awareness to these situations while circumventing the mainstream blackout of it? And then he has a specific section here. He says to Helga, so this is specific to you, Helga, what must be done to alleviate the destruction of Syria and integrate the nation into worldwide development programs like the Belt and Road Initiative? So it's really a two-part question, which is what can the average citizen do to bring awareness and circumvent this blackout, if anybody has any particular recommendations there, and then something specific for you, Helga. So anybody want to take that?
Well, you know, just this weekend, there was a very significant protest held at the Lincoln Memorial, and it was termed Rage Against the Machine, but it had some very mainstream people there, and Ron Paul was a speaker, Jose Vega, a great dynamic young man, and had Tulsi Gabbard there, had a number, I think Dennis Kucinich. Anyway, a number of very fine speakers. I'm sure I'm leaving out a dozen people who should be mentioned, but anyway, we have been slow to have demonstrations against the war in this country, but this was a very good beginning. And I think what we are seeing with some of the young people who are directly challenging different senators and congressmen at public appearances is a very good thing. And as Vanessa particularly pointed out, it is the deep state. It's not Republican or Democrat. We recently had the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee parroting some absurd remarks by a clown of a general who said we're going to be at war with China in 2 years. Now, he may be right, but the general is certainly a clown and an irresponsible person. But here you have the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Republican, who is parroting and say, well, I think there's something to what this general says. Well, you're talking about almost certain nuclear war. If we end up in a combined war with Russia and China, I don't see any way that we escape a nuclear conflagration that destroys, half, 2/3, or more of the Earth's civilization. But anyway, these confrontations, we need to just not simply go after policies, but go after people. Put them on the spot, make them explain why they are willing to roll the dice on nuclear war. What are we doing on the other side of the earth, forcing the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass to accept dominance by Ukrainian people that hate their guts and wish they were all dead? Yeah, they're technically Ukrainians, but they are culturally Russian people that are the subject of the war in Ukraine. So there's so much going on, and I will just add one thing. I didn't make my remarks about Trump to be partisan in any way. I certainly was very opposed to the killing of General Soleimani, who was probably one of the two generals most responsible for the defeat of ISIS. A great hero in terms of from the Syrian perspective, and a fellow who was under the flag of truce going to engage in peace talks with Saudi Arabian officials, something that had been set up in advance, and then he was targeted with a GPS-seeking missile and killed. And that was very unconscionable. So I don't want to suggest that. I will say this, that I think that the reason that Trump got in trouble was that he wanted to downgrade and potentially dismantle NATO. And I think as soon as he said that, he was on his way to having his administration dismantled, which it ultimately was.
All right. Helga, do you want to say anything about this section of the question that you were asked?
Well, it's very difficult because, it's almost that there is a load of problems, they're piling up. And, if you look at them one by one, it could almost become, depressive, because in many countries, like my country, Germany, the majority of people are so depressed about the, accumulation and the feeling that you can't do anything about it. But that is a wrong perception. I look at it in a different way. I mean, my late husband, LaRouche, had prognosed that we would come to this point 52 years ago, in 71, when Nixon went in the direction of this monetarist profit maximization only policy by abandoning the old Bretton Woods system. And he at that time said that, if you continue on this road, you will inevitably come to a new fascism, a new depression, a new danger of a world war, or you go in the direction of a completely different system. And we are exactly at that point. I mean, there is no question that we are sitting on the absolute tip of the potential explosion into a global thermonuclear war. But that is only one aspect of the picture, because the other thing is that as it becomes more clear to many, people and countries, that the system is the way we have been hearing how it shows up in Syria and in many other places. Haiti is another atrocious example. It is also clear that the majority of the world is moving in another direction. You have right now the massive effort to set up a new economic system. And, frankly, that system is already becoming stronger than this decaying Western liberal model. naturally, it's still the strongest war machine. But on the other side, you can't fool with the Russian new weapons, like the hypersonic missiles. What Colonel Blackwood, or Senator Blackwood, you mentioned about the alliance between Russia and China. Well, let me say this, and you are not allowed to say this, but I'm saying it anyway. There is nothing wrong with China. Russia has been provoked into this crisis. You may regret it, and everybody who hates war does regret it. But, and again, I never would have thought I'm saying this, because Jeffrey Sachs was a key person to be a problem in the 90s in Russia. But listen to what he's saying now. He is telling it as it is, and I can only advise people to take the recent video from Jeffrey Sachs, where he describes exactly how NATO was driving Russia into this war. And, you can attack Jeffrey Sachs, but he is mainstream establishment, he's a decorated professor. So there are, many things happening right now. I think the most incredible thing is the revelations by Seymour Hersh. The US administration can deny it up and down the wahoo, zoo, whatever. But today at 3:00 p.m. US time, there will be a UN Security Council meeting, where Ray McGovern has been asked to testify. This will be live transmitted. I can only suggest watch this, because the implication of, if it turns out that what Seymour Hersh is saying is true, and there speaks a lot for it, it will have an incredible effect. Because what does Germany need enemies for if you have friends like that? What does it mean if Norway participated in that? Big question. Did Stoltenberg know? He was the former prime minister of Norway. I mean, if that turns out to be what it seems to be, and there are now many, even mainstream media, who are reporting about it, this is a genie which cannot go back into the bottle. So you have an incredible conjuncture. It's extremely dangerous. There's no question about it. We could be blown up, and all of humanity could disappear, within hours and weeks, and then nuclear winter following that would eradicate all life on Earth. So the danger is as it was never before. But on the other side, it is the enormity of what the situation is under the present system, which is also bringing people together. I mean, the rally which took place on Sunday in Washington, for the first time, had all people from all kinds of political directions, so-called right, left, this view, that view, and they all agreed that in light of this danger of nuclear war, let's put our differences aside, let's deal with them later, once we have secured mankind from the threat of extinction. That unity is also a very important new factor. And that brings me to, the campaign we are involved in, which is, that given the fact that world war is threatening the existence of every human being on the planet, that turns everybody automatically into a world citizen. So with a series of conferences, the Schiller Institute has called for a movement of world citizens. And, coming from Trier, I took the liberty to say the new slogan should be "Citizens of all countries unite," in a famous change of a sentence from the man from Trier. This time it comes from the woman from Trier. And I think if all citizens of the world unite, we are for sure the majority. And, I think the fact that you have right now the new system emerging, the BRICS Plus will have maybe 17 new members fairly soon. There are other organizations which are forming, collaboration, the SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union. And very important, China has just made a proposal for a new security architecture, which, even if it's different than the new security architecture which I have been proposing, there are elements which are exactly the same. The importance of sovereignty, the need to take into account the security interests of every country. So the idea that you need to have a new order which takes into account the interest of every country on the planet is becoming a more powerful idea. And I think, frankly, we have to mobilize the world public on the plight of the Syrian people. But I think it will only be solved if we have a new world security system and development architecture which really takes into account the interests of all of humanity. And I would urge all of you to help to build that, because in the final instance, I think that's the only way how we will get out of this crisis.
All right. Marwa, did you want to say something?
I just have one, I want to say one thing fast, because I have to leave as well, because I have 3 kids that I need to tuck in bed. It's about to get 9 p.m. in Beirut, so sorry for that. I just wanted to say something concerning the question that was asked. I know how important everything that Senator Black and Ms. Helga spoke about, but for the ordinary Syrian who is now either lost his house or lost his family, right now, in all honesty, this means nothing to them. So if you really want to help a Syrian family, if you are in a small town in Montana or in Utah or in North Carolina, whatever state you are, and you wanted to help, get into your church, your mosque, into your community, try to raise funds, try to get help, and then go to your representatives and tell them, well, you supposedly lifted the sanctions for 180 days. We want to help the Syrian people. We want to send funds to Syria. We want to send aid and relief to Syria, and then listen to what they have to say. First of all, you get an answer as to why they never lifted the sanctions. Second of all, you will hear firsthand why and how the United States of America is actually obstructing any aid and relief that needs to get to the Syrian people. And if they tell you that there are funds going to X and Y, and you open them and you see white helmets, Al-Qaeda, white helmets in the northern part of Syria, tell them, no, we would like to help Aleppo as well. Just like we helped Idlib, we would like to help Aleppo, we'd like to help Hama, we'd like to help Latakia and Jable. These are the most affected areas by the earthquake in Syria. So if you really want to help, you start by doing that and asking the right questions to your representatives in your small towns, because that question will resonate and go to the big guys. And I want to thank you again for allowing me to be part of this panel, but I sadly have to go attend to my kids. Thank you very much.
You should just know that we have, right as we're speaking, a delegation that's right now in the Congress of the United States. They're walking in the halls of the Congress right now. So some of those questions can, in fact, be asked at this moment. So thank you for being with us. Very, very important that you were with us today. Thank you. There was another question. And do we have somebody on the line or not? Because I have a question because I can go with. Okay, fine. So we just got sort of a group of these that came in to us. And there was a question here. How is it possible that this is from Walter Niedermeyer? How is it possible that the sanctions, in fact, cannot be lifted by a single European Union country? How are the EU countries bound to follow all the same course against Syria and Russia? And how is it possible that the U.S. has so much power over the media in the EU? That's the question.
Well, that's an excellent question, very good one, because who are we to govern the laws of other independent sovereign nations? But the fact is that we enforce our sanctions through raw power. We have the ability to punish. Now, the European Union is a special case where we've simply gotten them to the point where they are so subservient. They grovel at our feet. They take no independent action on their own. They simply have become sort of satellite nations that are dominated by the United States. I have a great love for Europe. I lived there for several years, and I just hate to see their subservience. But they will enforce the sanctions because they fear the United States. There's a genuine terror of what the U.S. might do. We might sanction you, if you don't enforce our sanctions. So, and one of the problems is that with Syria in particular, a country, let's take India or China. It's sort of a balancing game. They say, look, we've got a small, impoverished nation, and if we do something to help them, then we risk the wrath of a massive trading entity, and the payoff is just not big enough. So that's one of the things. But it is unfortunate. I think I really hope at some point that we will have overplayed our hands so dramatically with sanctions that the world simply says, you know what, we're a sovereign country. We haven't imposed sanctions on anybody, and we don't intend to abide by the sanctions you have. I don't know whether we're going to reach that point. I think there'll have to be a point where people are less fearful of the United States. They don't do it out of love. They don't do it out of respect for what we're doing, but they do it out of raw terror that we may turn our wrath on them.
I want to acknowledge a question. Okay, Helga, you want to respond? Then I'll go on.
And just to add one thing, in general, I agree with you, but that is true for the majority of the people and normal institutions. It's not true for the EU bureaucracy, because they're perfectly fine to be part of this transatlantic establishment, because these are people who don't have fatherlands. They don't have loyalties to their own country, as long as they belong to their, let's say, to the club of establishment, who have the privileges. So I would just add that, because they are as complicit with all of this as the US government or the British government. I just wanted to qualify that, because I think we need sovereignty, and I think we should leave the EU as much as we should leave NATO, because these are the instruments of this, causing this subservience, what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, Vanessa, go ahead. I think you're
moderator, Chandra.
No, first Vanessa, and then to you. Right.
Sorry, I'll be very quick. I also wanted to add that I don't think it's only US interference or influence on EU policy. You also have a very powerful Israeli lobby, a Zionist lobby, both in the UK and in the EU, and also a very powerful, in the case of Syria, Muslim Brotherhood lobby and presence, both in the UK. I mean, their headquarters were in the UK in London, but they're also very powerful across the EU, and they are influencing policy regarding Syria and regarding the sanctions. So it's a three-pronged influence being brought to bear upon the EU, and also being pushed through by the UK. The UK, in my opinion, is behind the intelligence operations in Syria, and it's driving much of the agenda in Syria. When Trump actually wanted to pull out in 2017, what happened? The White Helmets were instructed to carry off the Khan Shaykhun chemical weapons attack, and Trump was forced by the UK effectively to maintain a military presence in Syria. So I think it's more complex than just the US having the power to influence EU policy. I think there's other players in there with regards to Syria.
Yes. Chandra, did you have something?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, moderator. I would like to begin where Vanessa left off, about the Muslim Brotherhood. This is an area which I've looked at, and the others who have also done research on this. There is no doubt at all that the Muslim Brotherhood has played a significant role in undermining the Syrian government. And if you look at the mobilization of Muslims in different parts of the world to support these extreme terrorist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood had a hand in that. And it's true that in the situation that is unfolding, if you look at the influence upon Europe in particular and the role of Britain, the Muslim Brotherhood that has got links with some of the groups there, I think it's been an important player, and we have to keep that in mind. But having said that, I would like to make 2 points very quickly. Number one, we should not underestimate in terms of the changes that will have to take place. We should not underestimate the relationship between Russia and China. This, to my mind, is important from various perspectives. It is important from the perspective of geopolitics and strategy, because the China-Russia relationship is a relationship between the most significant land mass on Earth. And in terms of strategies, it is this land mass more than any other convergence that will make an impact upon the way in which naval power and air power and perhaps even territorial power in terms of military armies and so on, how these instruments of power have been able to exercise a great deal of influence in the past. So the coming together of Russia and China, and I think this is something that this Wisconsin professor, Dr. McCoy, has argued very eloquently. I think this coming together of Russia and China is very, very significant. Don't forget, there was a time when they came together and they broke up. And the US is determined to break up this relationship between Russia and China, which is why I think the Chinese have been very wise in the way in which they've approached the question of Ukraine. On the one hand, they know the underlying forces at work. On the other hand, they know that responding to hegemony and the US NATO push for hegemony by going to war may not be the wisest approach. And that is being proven now. But having said that, we'll have to set that aside for a while. But having said that, let's not forget that the Russia-China axis is founded upon far more important principles in terms of both strategy, in terms of resources, in terms of the populations that they have, and the way in which they look at the world, and the way in which they look at tradition, history, the way in which they want to harness the values from their own cultures and try to shape the world that is yet to be born. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind when we talk about all these changes. Let's make sure that in the midst of all this, while we confront hegemony, we also have to ensure that the Russia-China relationship remains strong and steady. The second point that I want to make is what is different this time from, let's say, the Iraq War, where we also saw mass mobilization much greater than what we have seen now. And there are reasons why 2003 Iraq was very different from what we are witnessing at this moment. It's got something to do with the way in which the US military has penetrated various sectors of society in the United States. They sort of paralyzed various groups from wanting to respond to the situation, to the challenges that faces today, which is also why you notice that peace groups, anti-war groups have been quite weak. They've been deliberately weakened in the intervening years between 2003 and say the last 2 or 3 years. And this is the situation that confronts us at the moment. But I don't think this will be there forever. I think there is tremendous potential, and this is the crucial point that I want to make, for individuals and groups to stand up and to respond to this in a situation. One should not fall into despair. In some ways, technology is on our side. We should be able to harness the new technologies for this purpose. In some respects, I think the powers that be, the dominant forces, are also going to help us rise. Because if you look at what has been happening, both in the case of Britain, which is a Machiavellian force behind all the things that we have talked about, and the United States, if you look at some of the other Western powers too, there are a lot of weaknesses. And these are internal weaknesses. These are not weaknesses brought about by geopolitics as such. I don't think any country which gives so much attention to military hardware, where your priorities are all wrong. You ignore poverty in your own country, and that is growing. You ignore the gap between rich and poor and the concentration of wealth, which has become more and more obvious and hideous. You ignore all this. You ignore the way in which social communities are breaking up. You ignore your crime rate, the killings that are taking place. You ignore the way in which the political system itself is becoming dysfunctional. You ignore all this and concentrate upon military hardware. In a sense, Ukraine has brought this to the fore. Look at the amount of money that is being spent, that is being directed towards Ukraine in terms of military hardware. There's this hope, which of course is all false, and they themselves know it, that Ukraine would be able to defend Western democracies and freedom and so on. We know that this is not true. I mean, don't forget that there are neo-Nazis elements within the power structure in Ukraine, and they have played an influential role. All this is true. We can't run away from the fact that the reality on the ground is something else from what the media is reporting, especially the Western media. But nonetheless, this emphasis upon military hardware, ignoring the real problems of the people, is in fact linked to yet another dimension of this dichotomy. And what is that dimension? In many societies all over the world, you see this happening. There is a clear line that is developing between elites on the one hand and ordinary people. People see things in a different way. If you asked the average American today, of course they would say that jobs are more important. They would say that the economy is more important. They're more concerned with inflation. And yet, if you look at the elites, they're focusing on something else. For them, it is military hardware and this geopolitical game that is more important. And that would be true of Britain. It would be true of, which is why with all the strikes happening in Britain, it would be true of other countries too, all over the world, even countries which are not part of the global north. There's the same dichotomy that is developed between the elites on the one hand and the people. And I think this is what gives us hope. We will not be able to mobilize, perhaps the way in which mobilization took place in 2003, because the situation is different. But nonetheless, I think more and more groups will come out. Perhaps the demonstration outside Lincoln's Memorial is just a beginning. There would be other events, I hope, in other parts of the world. And that sort of people's mobilization added to the relationship between China and Russia and the other changes that are taking place, meaning by which problems in the economy and problems in terms of social relations and so on, would eventually bring about the change that we want. It's not going to be a sort of unilateral process. It's not going to be as if these things can be predicted like a line in a graph. It's going to be much more complex. There'll be ups and downs, but nonetheless, I think we're on the verge of a major change. Anyone who argues, for instance, that the unipolar world will come back is sadly mistaken. All signs indicate that it will be a multipolar world, but its shape is what is still unclear. How it will develop, what sort of centers of power will emerge, what sort of relationships. And I think there are also signs that show that very important elements in our eternal perennial wisdom, in our great cultures and religions, that they will resurface and express themselves in a very dynamic manner. But how that will happen, we don't know. These are things that will be shaped for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to right now acknowledge a few questions which would have been addressed by Mike Robinson, who had technical problems and he was unable to get on. He was unable to get a clear internet signal. Ulf Sandmark asked the question, there are many who want to aid Syria. Could you say something about the white helmets who are now in the forefront to try to collect that money for Syria? Actually, Vanessa addressed this in part. The white helmets have a British background, which you pointed to, so forth. And there was another person by the name of Carl who asked a similar question about, I just read that the British government has recently issued a statement telling other countries that they shouldn't send aid to Syria because the Syrian government may steal it. Can anyone address the British role in the war on Syria? Let me simply say that Mike is going to do a presentation. We won't see it here because he can't be hooked up, and we will make that available to people because he was going to be addressing that and related questions in what he had to say. we're pretty much at time, and I want to just do the following. I'm going to just read another. There are many comments that began to come in, and if you were you going to say something, Vanessa? Did you have your hand up, or did I just?
No, sorry.
You weren't. Okay, fine. Just checking. So I just wanted to otherwise read one other comment from the United States. Now, this is not so that everybody responds to it. It's more to know that this question was submitted. This is from my friend. His name is Scott Muhammad. He's from the Nation of Islam. He lives down in Alabama. And he says, as a young man, I was in the Million Man March, which was called in 1995 by Minister Louis Farrakhan. There were 1.7 million of us on the mall. It was entirely peaceful. So there is a possibility to mobilize in America, but it is now 27 years later, and things are very much the same. He said, but at that time, I was made aware of the kind of policies like the National Security Study Memorandum 200, which talked about depopulating various countries in the world. And you had the depopulation wars in South America. You had them in El Salvador. You have depopulation wars now in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. There's depopulation that has happened in different ways, including familiar to those of us in some ghetto neighborhoods. He said the Nation of Islam puts out a paper called The Final Call, and there's a reason it's called that, because there's a certain point at which it is now then too late to mobilize. Is there a way to identify that there's this global depopulation policy so that all can see that they are the target, that it is not just a fight in one place or another? He said, if you look at what has just happened to the people in East Palestine, Ohio, maybe there's a way for them to look at that and think about the people in Palestine itself. So he sort of is ruminating more about the United States and about this idea of how we can mobilize. So I don't say this for people to have to comment on this as such, but he did submit that. Other questions were sort of, we've repeated them already. So what I think I'm going to do is just give everyone the chance now to say some things in summary, any final thoughts or anything that you may have had a chance to address in any of the questions that you've heard so far. I think we'll begin with Vanessa. Could we begin with you?
Okay. Actually, if you don't mind, I would like to just very quickly address about the white helmets, because I've conducted, I think now more than 7 years investigation into this group, both on the ground and through analysis and research. I would recommend boycotting this group. They were established by a former British military intelligence operative in 2013 in Turkey and in Jordan. They were effectively a shadow state construct that replaced the real Syria Civil Defense, a Syrian organization established in 1953, and the only one recognized in Syria by the International Civil Defense Organization. The white helmets are not only embedded with the armed groups, they are members of the armed groups, and in some cases, it's all documented, they are leaders of armed groups such as Nusra Front. I have documentation from the British government in 2017, who is their primary funder. Of course, the US is a secondary funder, and then various members of the regime change cartel against Syria are also funding this organization. In 2017, the British government made it quite clear in official documentation that the white helmets were there to corroborate British foreign policy, and that included the staging of the chemical weapon events that were designed to not only criminalize the Syrian government armed forces and allies, but also, of course, to enable further military, political, and economic intervention to destabilize Syria. The latest, of course, was the Douma chemical attack in 2018, when I was in Damascus, both before and after, and the white helmets have been exposed to have staged the events in the hospital. The OPCW report has been shown to be based upon fraudulent testimony from the white helmets and other groups attached to the Anglosphere cartel fighting against Syria. And the dissident inspectors at the OPCW have declared the OPCW both compromised, corrupted, and influenced by the nations that are funding it to retrospectively justify the US, UK, and French unlawful aggression against Syria before the OPCW inspectors had even been able to go in April 2018. This group, the White Helmets, they tried to repair the brand. They stand accused by Syrian civilians of organ trafficking, child abduction, torture, murder, theft, detention, and various other war crimes. They are tasked effectively with documenting war crimes and have never documented a single armed group war crime since their establishment in 2013. Now they are being resurrected and the funding is coming into them. Millions is being raised for them because people are now blinded, of course, by the tragedy of the earthquake, and they have forgotten the history of this group, and the money now is pouring into them, but it's not pouring to them. It's going into the armed groups, as I said, to refresh the military war against the Syrian government. So please, and I can't say this strongly enough, please call for an independent inquiry into this criminal group, and please boycott them as regarding funding, because they are the enemies of the Syrian people.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for that. Colonel Black.
Yeah, I would certainly parrot that. Vanessa she's probably the world's greatest authority on the White Helmets at this point. And I have never seen any convincing evidence that they are not a part of the Al-Qaeda organization and devoted to overthrowing the government of Syria through armed terrorist activities. So I think that's very authoritative. I guess I would advise any nation in the world to be most cautious of these NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that enter their countries with high-sounding names, like they're going to bring about all kinds of good things within those countries. Because typically, they are directed, orchestrated, influenced by the Central Intelligence Agency or by MI6 or one of these organizations that are designed to infiltrate the country, determine where the sources of weakness are, demonize the country, and then overthrow it through armed violence. I think there have been a number of countries that have ousted their NGOs. El Salvador is one recent one, which has they've just managed to drive their crime rate down to just a tiny fraction of what it was. And in the course of it, they got rid of some American NGOs that they knew would work against anything that is going to raise up the people of the country. So the NGOs are a great danger. It's unfortunate, but that is the way that they have evolved over decades. And the White Helmets certainly would fall in that category. I would certainly advise anyone to avoid working with them or contributing to them.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Mustafa?
Thank you, moderator. I would like to endorse what Vanessa had said about the White Helmets. And we have done a little bit of work on this discredited group. And I think it is very important that people become aware of what they have been doing and what they're up to. And it's important that aid that is meant for the Syrian people does not fall into the hands of groups like this, who would be undermining a legitimate government and further strengthening the forces of evil in that part of the world. The point I want to make very quickly is, and it's related to the White Helmets, I think there's a great need for NGOs and groups who have noble purposes, who understand hegemony, who understand the whole question of dominance and control, what is happening today, the most important reality in international politics, for all these groups to work together. We tend to work in silos. This is part of the problem. Very often we don't even know what others are doing. We don't share the sort of information and knowledge that different groups have accumulated through their work. I think this is a major challenge. We may be small, we may be modest in our effort, but it's so important for us to work together. And if we can work together, then I think we'll be able to strengthen the people's voices. We'll be able to strengthen the alternative that we are talking about. It is working together that is the most important challenge facing us. And especially with all the new technologies that are available, we should harness this effort to the best of our ability. Thank you.
Thank you. Helga?
Well, I think there is reason for optimism despite all of the pain and problems. And that is that I think we are human, and that means we are all gifted with creative reason. I mean, that's what distinguishes us from all other living species, at least those known on the planet Earth. And that means that even multipolarity is not the final word, because multipolarity, I think unipolar world is dead. It will never come back. But multipolarity is not good enough because it does still contain the germ of geopolitics, that you define the interest of one group of nations against another group. And that could still lead to war. I think the evolutionary change, which we have to be conscious about, is that we are entering a new epoch where man is capable to think about the one humanity first and then think about your nation second. And the two must not be in contradiction at all, as Friedrich Schiller correctly said, that there must be not a contradiction between a patriot and a world citizen. And I think we have to train ourselves and the people we are working with to think in terms of this higher one as a method of thinking. I always resort to Nicolaus of Cues and his coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, which is that there is a higher one which supersedes the conflicts on the lower level of the many. Now, Nicolaus naturally came to that through a theological discussion, the higher one obviously being the creator, but it is not only a theological argument, but it is a method of thinking that you always can think the higher interest of the totality, in this case of all of humanity, as a primary consideration. And I think that if we think this way, then it will quite follow naturally that we will also start to think that the present, the outgrowth of this geopolitical confrontation is not natural, but that we should, as a creative species, think what kind of order can we give ourselves that we can live peacefully together. And again, Nicolaus of Cues, a scientist from the 15th century, he said the only reason why people from different nations and different cultures can communicate and be peaceful together is because they all produce artists, scientists, musicians, people who have universal principles as their concern. And since universal principles are what is universal, which is that they are true in Africa, they are true in Malaysia, they are true in Ohio, and therefore we can agree on these principles. And I would like to really suggest that we discuss these principles. How should we as a human species work together? And I would like to enter a kind of collaboration with as many groups as possible, what you, Chandra, are saying, that we should work together and we should communicate about these fundamental ideas of how we order the affairs on this planet to make a long-term survivability of all nations a certainty. So, let's just collaborate in this spirit. And otherwise, I want to thank you again, and we will bring this message about Syria out as widely as we can.
Right. Chandra Musaffar, Vanessa Beeley, Colonel Black, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, we want to thank you for being with us today. We want to thank everyone who has also participated. Marwa Osman, Mike Robinson didn't manage to make it, but as I say, his presentation will be made available. We want to thank everybody that's watched and participated in this. We've been getting many questions about what else can be done vis-a-vis Syria. Just submit them in terms of the issues of where and how aid can in fact be made provided in various ways. But I think it was very clearly stated, the thing that people are going to have to do is to take this program, take programs like it, and make this the new knowledge that the American people and other people all over the world have. This is not an American, this is an international Schiller Institute broadcast. We want everyone all around the world to wake up and be part of what is awakening of people, which is going on all this week. There are rallies, demonstrations against the war. And I should also point out that this Thursday, we will be having another Schiller Institute conference, Investigate Nord Stream Revelations, Stop Nuclear World War III. And you can see there Colonel Ralph Bassard, Ray McGovern, former Central Intelligence Agency and founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche will be with us again. That's just in 2 days. And so we invite you all to join us for that. So on behalf of the Schiller Institute, we want to thank everyone for joining us today, and keep faith. And as they say, know where you stand and then stand there.